Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Usually, when we talk about history, we're obsessed with the shiny stuff. You know, the crowns, the scepters, the guys named Louis with the great calves, and the queens with the complicated necklines, and even more complicated genetic charts. We look at the people standing in the spotlight, wearing the velvet, making the laws, and usually making a mess of things. But tonight, I want you to dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket that's actually comfortable and like the ones we're going to talk about and settle in. We're going to ignore the guy on the throne. Instead, we're going to look at the person standing 20 feet behind him, blending into the wallpaper, holding a tray of lukewarm pheasant. We are drifting into the quiet, repetitive, and frankly exhausting lives of royal servants. The people who made the beds, scrubbed the stone floors, emptied the chamber pots, which is a whole adventure on its own, and essentially kept the great machinery of the monarchy running while the royals were busy having meltdowns about protocol. It's a world of silence, strict hierarchy, and really early mornings. So let's just take a deep breath, forget about the modern world for a bit, and imagine stepping into a drafty, candlelit corridor of a massive palace. Long before the sun comes up, the first thing you have to understand about being a royal servant, whether you were at Versailles under the Sun King or Buckingham Palace under Victoria, is that you were essentially a biological robot. Your entire purpose was to anticipate needs before they happened and to remain entirely invisible. While doing it, it's a bit of a paradox, really. You had to be everywhere, cleaning everything, fixing every hem, and lighting every fire. But if a royal actually noticed you, you had failed. You were supposed to be part of the furniture, just furniture that breathes and occasionally gets yelled at by a steward. Let's start at the beginning of the day. And when I say beginning, I don't mean a sensible 7 a.m. I mean the middle of the night. For the lower staff, the scullery maids, and the hall boys, the day began around 4 o'clock or 5 a.m. And remember, these palaces were not cozy. They were giant, stone barns designed to impress foreign dignitaries, not to keep heat in. So, picture waking up in a cramped attic room, or worse, a makeshift bed in a basement corridor, shivering because the heating system is just hope and war. The first task was always the fires. Before the king, the queen, or even the slightly more important servants like the butler woke up, the housemaids had to glide through the palace like ghosts. They had to clean out the grates from the night before, which were full of ash and soot, and lay perfectly constructed new fires. And they had to do this silently. God forbid you clang a fire iron and wake up a duke. That's a one-way ticket to unemployment. So you have these women, probably in their teens or early 20s, carrying heavy buckets of coal through endless, dark corridors, trying to be as quiet as mice, while surrounded by creepy portraits of ancestors judging their cleaning technique. Down in the kitchens, things were even less glamorous. If you've ever complained about doing the dishes after a dinner party, spare a thought for the scullery maid. She was the lowest of the low in the female hierarchy. Her life was basically sand, soda, and hot water. Before the invention of decent dish soap, you scrubbed pots with sand. Iron pots. Heavy, greasy, blackened iron pots that had been used to cook 12-course meals for people who probably only ate 3 bites of it. Her hands would be raw, red, and cracked pretty much all the time. But on the bright side, at least the kitchen was warm. It smelled like old grease and unwashed bodies, but it was warm. While the scullery maid was destroying her cuticles, the rest of the below-stairs world was waking up to a strict military routine. This wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle, mostly because you lived where you worked and you had 0 privacy. The hierarchy was intense. You might think the king was the one in charge, but for a footman or a housemaid, the king was just a vague concept, like the weather. The real terrified authority figures were the housekeeper and the butler. The housekeeper, usually a woman of a certain age who had seen everything and was impressed by nothing, carried a ring of keys that jangled like the bells of doom. She controlled the supplies: tea, sugar, candles, linen. Everything was locked up. Because, apparently, if you left the servants alone with a candle, they'd steal it. Or eat it. Who knows? But the paranoia was real. The staff had to line up for inspection, making sure their uniforms were spotless, their hands were clean, and their expressions were suitably vacant. You couldn't look happy, because that implies you're having fun, and fun is not efficient. But you couldn't look miserable, because that's depressing for the royals. You had to cultivate a face of polite nothingness. Now, let's float over to the male side of things. The footmen. If you've seen any period drama, you know the footmen. They're the tall guys standing by the doors looking decorative. And that was literally their job. Being tall and decorative. In the 18th and 19th centuries, footmen were hired based on their calves. I'm not joking. A footman with well-turned calves was a status symbol. They wore knee breeches specifically to show off their legs. If you were a skinny guy with knobby knees, sorry, no career in the palace for you. You're destined for the stables. But the footmen actually had a pretty rough time of it, despite the fancy outfits. They were the ones who had to stand still for hours. Just imagine standing in a drafty hallway, in shoes that definitely don't have arch support, staring at a wall, waiting for a bell to ring. You couldn't lean, you couldn't sit, and you certainly couldn't check your pocket watch. You just existed, and they had to powder their hair. This is one of those historical details that sounds quaint until you realize the logistics. Hair powder was made of flour and grease. To get it to stick, you had to grease your hair usually with animal fat, and then someone would puff flour onto your head until you looked like a dusty ghost. Now, imagine doing that every single day. The smell, the itchiness, the fact that flour and grease is basically a recipe for dough, which attracts mice. There are actual historical accounts of servants having to sleep with special caps on to keep vermin from snacking on their hairstyles. So, while the Duke is downstairs eating roast duck, the footman is upstairs worrying about becoming a snack for a rat. The glamour of the court, right? As the sun actually came up, the upper servants began their rituals. This is where we get into the weirdly intimate stuff. The valets and the ladies' maid. These people were the elite. They didn't scrub floors. They touched the royal person. And because they touched the royal person, they were considered superior to everyone else. It's a weird transitive property of royalty. I put on the king's socks, therefore I am better than you, who merely cooks the king's eggs. The morning dressing ritual for a monarch, say, Louis XIV of France, the absolute champion of making simple things complicated, was a theatre production. It wasn't just wake up and put on pants. It was the lever, the rising. A crowd of nobles would watch the king wake up. But the valet? The valet was the guy who actually had to deal with the reality of a sleepy, grumpy king with morning breath. The valet's job was a minefield. You had to know exactly which shirt the king wanted, exactly how warm the water for shaving should be, and exactly how to hand him a towel without making eye contact in a weird way. If the king was in a bad mood, it was the valet's fault. If the razor was slightly dull, the valet's fault. If it was raining, probably also the valet's fault. And the level of detail was obsessive. There were manuals written on how to fold a napkin, how to brush a coat, how to walk backward out of a room without tripping over your own feet and causing a diplomatic incident. And let's talk about the laundry again for a second, because in a royal household, the volume of laundry was staggering. We were talking about table linens that were changed if they had a single speck of dust on them, sheets that were changed daily, undergarments layers and layers of them. And remember, no washing machines. This was all done by hand, in great steaming copper vats filled with lice soap that would burn your skin if you weren't careful. The washerwomen were usually kept separate from the rest of the staff, partly because the smell of boiling wet linen is overwhelming, and partly because they were considered rough. They were the engine room of hygiene, steaming and scrubbing away the evidence of royal life. But it wasn't just cleaning, it was the silence. That's the thing that really stands out when you read the diaries of old servants. The palace was designed to be acoustically segregated. There were hidden staircases, the back stairs, that ran behind the main walls like arteries. Servants would scurry up and down these narrow, dark, wooden staircases, carrying trays of tea, clean shirts, or messages, popping out of hidden doors in the wallpaper, doing their job, and vanishing again. To a visitor, it looked like magic. The fire just appeared lit. The bed just became made. But behind the walls, it was a constant traffic jam of people trying not to drop things. And the food. Oh, the food. You'd think working in a palace meant you ate well, and, to be fair, compared to a peasant in a ditch, you did. But the food chain was literal. The king and queen got the fresh, hot food. The leftovers went to the top officials. Their leftovers went to the upper servants. And by the time the food reached the scullery maids or the stable boys, it was basically cold mush and picked over bones. There was a weird trickle-down gastronomy happening. Here, enjoy this venison that 3 other people have already poked with a fork. But there was a certain pride in it, too. Even the lowest servant felt a strange sense of superiority over the common people outside the gates. They were royal servants. They wore the livery. They knew what the queen looked like before she put her wig on. They were part of the secret club, even if their membership involved emptying chamber pots. Speaking of chamber pots, we can't avoid it. It was a massive part of the job. In the days before indoor plumbing was reliable or existed at all, the groom of the stool was a high-ranking noble, sure, But the actual grunt work of dealing with waste fell to the lower staff. The sheer logistics of sanitation in a palace like Versailles are horrifying. We're talking about thousands of people. No toilets, just pots, and hallways, and corners. The job of the sweepers was endless. They would walk around with buckets and mops, fighting a losing battle against biology. It's a very different image from the ballroom scenes in movies, isn't it? Next time you picture a grand waltz, just remember there's probably a guy just out of frame frantically mopping up a situation behind a velvet curtain. And through all this, the servants had their own society, their own kings and queens. The butler was the king of the pantry. He sat at the head of the table in the servants' hall. No one sat until he sat. No one spoke until he spoke. If the butler didn't like you, your life was miserable. He could assign you the worst tasks, give you the coldest room, or dock your pay for insubordination, which usually meant you didn't polish a spoon shiny enough to see his face in it. The housekeeper, the queen of the linen closet, was equally terrifying. She watched the morals of the female staff. No fraternizing with the footmen, no giggling, no ribbons in your hair that were too bright. You were there to work, not to flirt. Of course, human nature, being what it is, the palaces were absolute hotbeds of romance and drama below stairs. But it all had to be conducted in whispered conversations in the laundry room or stolen glances across the dinner table. It was like a soap opera, but with more dusting. Let's take a moment to consider the pages. These were often young boys, sometimes teenagers, whose job was essentially to be runners. But in the Tudor times, for example, you had the turnspit. This is one of those jobs that makes you glad to be born in the modern era. Before mechanized rotisseries, if the king wanted a roasted pig, someone had to turn the spit over the fire, slowly, for hours. It was incredibly hot, boring, and smoky. Sometimes they used dogs to run in wheels to turn the spit, but often it was a small boy, a turnspit boy, sitting by a roaring fire in the middle of summer, cranking a handle so Henry VIII could have his pork. If he stopped, the meat burned, and the cook would likely throw a ladle at him. And as the day wore on in the palace, the rhythm changed. The morning frenzy of cleaning and dressing settled into the long, dull wait of the afternoon. The royals might go out hunting, or hold court, or just sit around being rich. The servants then entered the standby mode. This is the part of the job that is purely psychological torture. You have to be ready instantly, but you have nothing to do. You stand in the hall. You stare at the tapestry. You count the threads in the tapestry. You wonder if your legs are going to fall off. You hear a bell. You jump. It's just the wind. You go back to staring. It was a life of suspended animation, waiting for someone else's impulse to animate you. I need tea. Boom. You're moving. I need my boots. Boom. You're running. I'm bored. Go away. Boom. You're invisible again. But let's drift back to the physical environment for a second. The smell of the palace. We mentioned the kitchen grease and the hair powder, but layer onto that the beeswax. Miles and miles of wood paneling and floorboards that needed to be polished constantly. The smell of beeswax mixed with coal smoke, old velvet that can't really be washed, and the faint, sweet scent of lavender that the housekeepers used to try and mask the other smells. It must have been a thick, heavy atmosphere. The air would be hazy with dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, coming through the high windows that, by the way, someone had to climb a 40-foot ladder to clean. And the silence. I keep coming back to it. But the silent service was the gold standard. They wore soft-soled shoes. They were trained to open doors without clicking the latch. They communicated in hand signals or raised eyebrows. A good servant was a ghost. You only knew they had been there because the room was suddenly tidy. It's kind of spooky when you think about it. Being surrounded by people who are deliberately trying not to exist. So, as we settle into this world, imagine you are one of them. You've been up since 4 a.m. Your hands smell like lice soap and silver polish. You're standing in a corridor at Windsor or the Louvre. It's drafty. You're tired. But you're wearing a uniform that costs more than your family's house. You are part of the machine, and the machine never stops. In the next part, we're going to look at the specific. These are roles that existed only in royal courts, like the person whose sole job was to taste the food for poison, which is a great way to ruin your appetite, or the intricate, terrifying politics of the royal nursery, where a nanny could technically outrank a duchess if she was holding the baby. But for now, let's just leave our exhausted scullery maid scrubbing her last pot of the morning, dreaming of maybe, just maybe, getting 5 minutes to sit down. So, we've established that the palace was essentially a giant stone machine fueled by coal dust, elbow grease, and the silent panic of teenagers trying not to drop expensive things. But as we float deeper into the machinery of the court, we have to talk about the jobs that were, let's call them specialized. You see, in the modern world, we like jobs with clear titles. Accountant, barista, dog walker. But in a royal court, the titles were often fancy words for guy who deals with the awkward stuff. And there is no job more awkward or more ironically coveted than the groom of the stool. Now, I know what you're thinking. Stool sounds like a euphemism, and it is. It is exactly what you think it is. In the Tudor courts, and arguably well into the Stuart era, the groom of the stool was the man responsible for assisting the king with his bodily functions. It sounds like a punishment, doesn't it? Like something you'd make the new guy do as a hazing ritual. Oh, you dropped the silverware? Off to the royal water closet with you. But here's the weird, counterintuitive twist of royal logic. This was one of the most powerful positions in the entire kingdom. Think about it. When is a king most vulnerable? When is his guard down? When is he stuck in one place for 10 minutes with nothing to do but chat? Exactly. The groom of the stool was the king's captive audience. He was the one guy who saw the monarch not as a godlike figure wrapped in ermine, but as a human being dealing with digestion. Because of this intimacy, the groom became a confidant. While handing the king a towel or a piece of linen, or in some opulent cases, literal wool-stuffed silk, he could whisper things. He could suggest that maybe the Duke of Norfolk was getting a bit too loud, or that a certain cousin deserved a promotion. The groom of the stool held the secrets. He knew if the king was sick, if he was stressed, if he was mumbling about beheading someone. So, while the other nobles were out in the great hall bowing and scraping, the groom was in the withdrawing room, effectively running the country while holding a wash basin. It's a strange way to climb the corporate ladder, but hey, it worked. Let's drift away from the bathroom, which is probably for the best, and float down the long, drafty corridors to the dining hall. If the bedroom was a place of intimacy, the dining room was a place of paranoia. For a royal servant involved in food service, every meal was a potential crime scene. You weren't just serving dinner, you were preventing regicide. This brings us to the assay, or the tasting. We've all seen the cartoons where a king makes a nervous guy eat a grape to see if he keels over. But the reality was much more ritualistic, much slower, and honestly, much more annoying for everyone involved. The food would leave the kitchen, which, remember, was usually miles away from the dining room to prevent the smell of cooking from offending the royal nose. So, a procession of servants, led by a solemn official called the sewer, pronounced sower, thankfully, not the other way, would carry these covered dishes through the halls. It was a parade. Guards would salute the meat. I'm serious. If the king's roast beef walked by, you took off your hat. When the food finally arrived at the table, it wasn't just plated. Oh no, that would be too simple. The assay had to happen. This involved taking a piece of bread, dipping it into the sauce, or rubbing it on the meat, and then the servant eating it. Then they'd wait and wait, just to be sure the servant didn't turn green and collapse. They did this for the wine, the water, the salt, the bread, everything. Now, imagine you are the king. You are hungry. You have been hunting all day. You can smell the roast chicken. It's right there. But you have to watch 3 different guys ceremoniously nibble it, stare at the ceiling, swallow, and bow before you can take a bite. By the time the king actually got to eat, the food was almost invariably cold. That is the great tragedy of royal dining. The higher your rank, the colder your soup. There are stories of monarchs, like Queen Victoria, who ate at lightning speed because they were just so used to getting through the meal before it solidified. And here is the kicker for the guests. Royal protocol dictated that when the queen finished eating, everyone finished eating. So, if you were a guest and you were waiting for your food to be served, and Victoria decided she was done with her cold mutton, your plate was whisked away before you even picked up a fork. The servants had to be ninjas of plate removal, snatching half-eaten pheasants from the hands of hungry dukes. But let's look at the specific servant role of the carver. This wasn't just a guy with a knife. Carving meat was considered a high art form. In the medieval and Renaissance periods, young noblemen were trained in how to carve a bird in the air. Yes, in the air. You would spear a pheasant on a fork, lift it up, and slice it perfectly without touching the plate, letting the slices fall gracefully. If you hacked at it, social suicide. If you splashed gravy on the tablecloth, you might as well move to a monastery. The pressure was immense. You have the entire court watching your knife skills. It's like being a surgeon, which your patient is a dead duck, and the audience is judging your cuffs. And speaking of cuffs and cleanliness, let's talk about the table linen. We briefly mentioned the laundry before, but the napkin had its own cult. In the French court, the way a napkin was folded was a secret language. There were professional napkin folders. They could fold a piece of linen into the shape of a swan, a castle, a ship, or a lion. It took hours, and the servant in charge of the nef, a giant, boat-shaped container made of gold that held the king's personal napkin, and Salt had to guard it with his life. He stood by the nef like a sentry. You couldn't just grab a napkin to wipe your mouth. You had to be presented with it. It all seems so exhausting, doesn't it? The sheer amount of energy spent on things that don't matter. But that was the point. The more servants you had doing useless, complicated things, the more powerful you looked. Look at me. I am so rich I have a man whose only job is to ensure my salt cellar is pointing east. Now, let's leave the cold food and the performative napkins and float upstairs to the nursery. If you want to find the true center of palace anxiety, it's not the throne room, it's the royal nursery. The survival of the dynasty depended on the baby in the cradle. So, naturally, they surrounded that baby with a suffocating amount of staff and protocol. The royal nanny, or the governess, was a force of nature. In her domain, she outranked everyone. Even the queen had to ask permission to see her own child sometimes. The nursery was a fortress. The windows were often sealed shut because fresh air was considered dangerous. Drafts were the enemy, so the rooms were overheated, stuffy, and smelled of milk and wood smoke. Inside this hothouse, you had the rockers. This is a real job title. The rockers were women appointed to sit by the cradle and rock it. That's it. That was the job. But they had to do it with the precision of a metronome. If the baby woke up, panic. If the baby cried, panic. If the rocking stopped, you're fired. Imagine sitting in a dark, hot room for 8 hours, just pushing a wooden cradle back and forth, terrified that if you stop, the future king of England might get fussy. It's hypnotic just thinking about it. Rock. And then there were the wet nurses. This is one of the more tragic and strange roles in the servant hierarchy. Royal mothers rarely breastfed their own children. It was considered common and, frankly, they were too busy being queens. So, they hired a wet nurse. This woman was chosen based on a rigorous physical inspection: teeth, complexion, temperament. She had to be healthy, calm, and have a good supply of milk. But here's the sad part. To take the job, the wet nurse usually had to leave her own baby behind. She would move into the palace, live in luxury, eat the best food to ensure good milk, and bond with the royal baby. Meanwhile, her own child was often sent away to be raised by someone else or a relative. The emotional toll must have been heavy. You are pouring your life and love into this little prince who will grow up to rule the country, while your own child is miles away. The wet nurse was often the only person the royal child actually loved. History is full of stories of kings and queens who were cold and distant with their parents, but sent money and letters to their old wet nurses until the day they died. It was a bond forged in the quiet hours of the night, in the rocking chair, while the rest of the palace slept, and the precautions around the nursery were extreme. There were tasters for the baby's pap, a mix of bread and milk. There were guards at the door. There were people whose job was to inspect the diapers or clouts, to divine the health of the heir. Everything was analyzed. If the prince had a sniffle, the entire court held its breath. Let's shift gears slightly to the outside staff. The people who didn't live in the velvet claustrophobia of the main house, but had their own weird little kingdoms. I'm talking about the Department of Transport, which in 16th century terms meant the stables. The royal stables were a massive operation. We're talking hundreds of horses, and horses, much like royals, are high maintenance, fragile, and prone to kicking people. The head groom or the master of the horse was a high noble, but the guys doing the work, they were the stable hands, the farriers, and the coachmen. Sleeping in the stables was actually not the worst gig. It was warm, thanks to the horses. It smelled of hay and manure, which is arguably better than the unwashed bodies in the main palace. But the work was brutal. A royal coach was not a Honda Civic. It was a massive, gilded wooden box suspended on leather straps. It had no shocks. It weighed a ton. Before a journey, the cleaning required was intense. Mud was the enemy. A royal coach had to sparkle. And the footmen we mentioned earlier, when the coach was moving, their job got literal. They had to run alongside it, or stand on the back of it, holding on for dear life while it bounced over cobblestones. If the coach got stuck in the mud, which happened constantly, because roads were terrible, the footmen had to jump down in their silk stockings and velvet coats and push. There is nothing quite as humbling as pushing a 3-ton gold carriage out of a ditch, while the Queen sits inside wondering why we've stopped. There was also a specific servant called the strewer of herbs. This job existed because sanitation was optional. The palaces smelled. To combat this, a woman was paid to walk through the royal apartments before the Queen arrived and scatter fresh herbs, lavender, chamomile, meadowsweet, rosemary onto the floor. When people walked on them, the crushing of the leaves released a scent that momentarily covered out the smell of damp dog and old drain. It's the medieval equivalent of a plug-in air freshener. Just a woman with a basket, walking slowly, tossing leaves, trying to make a stone dungeon smell like a spring meadow. And let us not forget the keeper of the swans or the keeper of the king. Bears. Yes, bears. Royals loved exotic pets, and someone had to feed them. Can you imagine being the guy whose job description is go feed the polar bear that Henry III keeps in the Tower of London? The bear was allowed to go fishing in the Thames on a long leash. Someone had to hold that leash. Someone had to dry the bear off. That is a level of job stress that I don't think we can fully appreciate today. How was work, dear? Oh, fine. Nearly got mauled by a wet predator. The usual. As the evening wears on in our imaginary palace, the shift changes. The day servants, the cleaners, the laundry maids. The turnspits start to collapse into their beds. But a different crew is waking up. The night watch. The palace at night was a different world. It was dark. Really dark. Candles were expensive, so they weren't just left burning everywhere. The corridors were pools of blackness. Servants moving at night had to carry lanterns, and they had to be quiet. But the king needed protection. So, you had the yeomen of the guard or the Swiss guard sleeping on pallets right outside the royal bedroom door, literally blocking the entrance with their bodies. In the French court, a valet slept inside the king's room, on a trundle bed at the foot of the royal bed. He was tied to the king by a cord. Sometimes or just light sleeping. If the king coughed, the valet was up. There was no privacy, ever. Imagine trying to sleep knowing that there is a guy in a wig breathing quietly 6 feet away from you, waiting for you to ask for water. And for the servant, imagine trying to sleep knowing that if you snore, you might get executed for treason, okay? Maybe not treason, but definitely fired. It was a life of hypervigilance. The servants were the eyes and ears of the court. They saw who visited whom at midnight. They saw who was sneaking out of the queen's chambers. They saw who was crying, who was drunk, and who was plotting. But they had to remain silent. The dumb servant, the furniture. As we wrap up this section of the tour, picture the palace settling down. The fires are banked down to glowing embers. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn against the night chill. The herbs on the floor are crushed and fading. The groom of the stool has finally gone off duty, taking his secrets with him. The rocker is finding a rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. The wet nurse is awake, staring at the canopy of the royal cradle. The great machine slows down, but it never really stops. Because in a few hours, the scullery maid will wake up, break the ice on the water bucket, and start scrubbing the sand against the iron pot all over again. In the next part, we're going to look at the health of these servants or the lack thereof. We'll talk about the royal touch, the bizarre medical treatments the staff was subjected to, and what happened when a servant got too old or too sick to be useful. It's a bit tragic, but also filled with that strange, resilient humor that humans always find when life is tough. So, pull the blanket up a little higher, and let's get ready to drift into the medical history of the below-stairs world. Welcome back to the shadows of the palace. If you're just joining us, or if you've drifted off and woke up wondering why we're talking about coal dust, just close your eyes again. We're still here. We're still walking the long, silent corridors of the royal household, checking in on the people who are currently trying to rub the tarnish off a silver platter without making a sound. In this stretch of our journey, we need to talk about the physical reality of being a biological machine for the monarchy. We've talked about the work, the carrying, the scrubbing, the standing, but we haven't really talked about the toll it took. Because unsurprisingly, the human body is not designed to stand still for 12 hours a day, wearing shoes that are essentially leather bricks, nor is it designed to scrub cold stone floors. On its hands and knees until the joints calcify. Let's start with the knees. It's not a glamorous body part, but for the lower female staff, it was the center of their universe. There was a specific medical condition known as housemaid's knee. It's a swelling of the bursa, a fluid-filled sac in the knee joint. Today, you get it if you're a carpet layer or a gardener. In the 18th century, you got it because you were a scullery maid. Imagine the sensation. You wake up on your pallet in the attic. It's freezing. You swing your legs out of bed, and your knees feel like they are filled with broken glass and hot water. But you have to kneel. That is the job. Kneeling to light the fire, kneeling to scrub the floor, kneeling to pray if you had the energy left for religion. It was a life lived at a 90-degree angle. And there was no workers' comp. There was no ibuprofen. There was just the vague hope that maybe, if you worked fast enough, the housekeeper would let you stand up to polish the doorknobs for a change. And then there was the air quality. We tend to romanticize candlelit rooms. It looks so soft and warm in the movies. But in reality, a palace was a chemical hazard zone. You had hundreds of candles made of tallow, which is animal fat burning and smoking. You had coal fires in every room belching soot. You had the gas lights in the Victorian era, which hissed and leaked fumes that slowly poisoned everyone and turned the silver black. The servants were breathing this soup 24/7. They slept in the attics where the heat and the smoke rose. Respiratory issues were just a standard feature of the uniform. A footman with a chronic cough was about as common as a king with a mistress. They just tried to cough quietly into a handkerchief, preferably when the royals weren't looking. But what happened when a servant got properly sick? Not just my knees hurt sick, but I can't get out of bed sick. Well, this is where the hierarchy gets interesting again. If you were a high-ranking servant, a valued valet, or a beloved nanny, you might actually get seen by the royal physician. This was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a great honor. On the other hand, 17th century medicine was basically just guesswork and leeches. The royal physician would arrive, looking very serious in a large wig, and prescribe something terrifying. Bloodletting was the go-to solution for everything from a fever to a sprained ankle. Oh, you have a headache. Let's drain a pint of blood from your arm. That should balance your humors. So you have a servant who is already malnourished and exhausted, and the doctor's solution is to make them anemic. Brilliant. For the lower staff, however, there was no royal physician. There was the apothecary, or the wise woman in the village, or just home remedies passed down in the servants' hall. Goose grease rubbed on the chest, vinegar compresses, a hot brick wrapped in flannel. It was survival of the fittest, really. If you were too sick to work, you were often just let go. There was no sick leave. If you couldn't scrub, you couldn't stay. This fear of being cast out kept people working through broken bones, fevers, and pleurisy. The palace ran on the adrenaline of employment insecurity. But there was one medical cure that was unique to the royal environment. A cure that didn't involve leeches, but involved something far stranger. The king himself. This brings us to the royal touch. For centuries, in England and France, it was believed that the monarch had the divine power to cure a specific disease called scrofula, which was a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes in the neck. It was nasty, painful, and very common among the poor. It was called the king's evil. The logic was, the king is anointed by God. Therefore, the king's hands are magic. Therefore, if the king touches your sores, you will be healed. It sounds completely bonkers to us, but people truly believed it. And the kings believed it too, or at least, they believed in the PR value of it. So, you would have these massive ceremonies. Charles, too, who was otherwise busy partying, touched nearly 100,000 people during his reign. Imagine the logistics. The servants had to organize this. They had to herd thousands of sick, infectious peasants into the palace, line them up, and make sure they didn't steal the silverware. The king would sit on a chair, and one by one, the afflicted would kneel before him. He would stroke their cheeks or neck, hang a gold coin and angel around their neck on a ribbon, and the chaplain would say a prayer. Then the servant would hustle them out and bring in the next one. It was an assembly line of miraculous healing. For the servants standing nearby, this must have been a surreal day at the office. You're holding a basin of water and a towel, watching your boss who you just saw eating a messy breakfast pretend to be a medical deity. And the king would have to wash his hands constantly. That was the servant's job. Here is the water, your majesty. Scrub hard. That guy looked contagious. There was also the ceremony of Maundy Thursday, where the monarch would wash the feet of the poor to imitate Jesus. Again, great PR, but a logistical nightmare for the staff. The poor were usually pre-selected by the almoner, a high-ranking official, to make sure they weren't too dirty. And before the king washed their feet, the yeomen of the guard washed them first. And before the yeomen washed them, the junior servants washed them. So by the time the queen or king actually touched the poor person's foot with a towel, that foot was cleaner than a dinner plate. It was a theatrical performance of humility, choreographed by the laundry staff. Let's drift from the spiritual cures to the dietary ones, or rather, the dietary disasters. We mentioned earlier that servants ate the leftovers, but in a rich household, the leftovers were rich. The servants' diet was heavy on meat, pastry, and sauces, and very light on vegetables. Vegetables were considered windy and somewhat suspicious in the medieval mind. The result, gout. We usually think of gout as a disease of wealthy old dukes, but it was rampant in the servants' hall too. The butler and the steward, who had access to the leftover port and the heavy beef dishes, often suffered terribly from swollen, painful joints. It's a cruel irony. You spend your life serving the rich, and your reward is a disease of excess, without ever actually having the money. And let's talk about the alcohol. The hydration strategy of the past was, water will kill you, drink beer. And they were right, mostly. The water was full of typhoid. The beer was boiled and fermented, so it was sterile. But this meant that everyone, from the scullery maid to the Lord Chamberlain, was functioning on a constant, low-level buzz. Servants were given a daily allowance of beer or ale. In some households, it was gallons, literally gallons. Small beer, which had a low alcohol content, was the Gatorade of the 17th century. You drank it for breakfast. You drank it while sweeping. You drank it before bed. It dulled the pain of the housemaid's knee, certainly, but it also meant the entire workforce was slightly dehydrated and perpetually woozy. It explains a lot about the breakage rates of porcelain. Now, what happened when the machine finally broke down? What happened when you got too old to carry the coal, or too blind to mend the lace? Retirement was a terrifying concept. For the vast majority of lower servants, there was no pension. When you couldn't work, you left. If you were lucky, you had saved some of your meager wages, or you had family in the country who would take you in. If not, the workhouse, the streets. It was a brutal drop from the velvet corridors of the palace to the gutter. However, for the faithful old retainers, the ones who had served for 40 or 50 years, there was a different fate, a sort of ghostly half-life within the palace walls. Royals, for all their aloofness, could be sentimental about their personal staff. If a nanny or a dresser had been with them since childhood, they couldn't just kick them out. So, they were kept on. They were given light duties, or no duties at all. They became part of the palace ecosystem, like an old dog sleeping by the fire. You can imagine these elderly servants shuffling through the halls of Windsor or Hampton Court. They knew where all the bodies were buried metaphorically and maybe literally. They knew the secret passages. They remembered the king when he was a toddler. The younger servants probably found them annoying or intimidating. Don't mind old Thomas. He just sits in the pantry and complains about how the silver polish isn't what it used to be. For the upper crust of the servant world, the retired courtiers, the widows of high-ranking staff, there were the grace and favour apartments. This is a fascinating British tradition. The monarch would grant the use of an apartment in one of the royal palaces, usually Hampton Court, or Kensington Palace rent-free. These weren't luxury condos. They were often weird, cobbled-together sets of rooms in the attic or the wings. They were drafty, full of old furniture, and miles away from a kitchen. But it was an address. You lived at the palace. You were a pensioner. Hampton Court in the 19th century was basically a giant, sprawling retirement home for the genteel poor. It was full of elderly widows of generals and ancient former ladies-in-waiting, all living in these little warrens of rooms, playing cards, drinking tea, and gossiping about things. That happened in 1790. It must have been a very quiet, very atmospheric place. The sound of canes tapping on the cobblestones, the rustle of faded silk, the smell of mothballs. A community of people waiting out the clock in the ruins of their former glory. But eventually, the clock runs out. Death in the palace. This was the ultimate breach of protocol. Royals famously hated the visual reminder of death. It was depressing. It ruined the vibe. Louis XV of France was terrified of it. So if a servant died, it had to be handled with extreme discretion. You didn't have a funeral procession down the main staircase. The body would be removed, usually at night, often through those backstairs we talked about. The unseen exit. The other servants would wear black armbands, perhaps, but they had to be subtle. You couldn't be sobbing while serving the soup. The show must go on. The polite nothingness of the servant's face had to extend even to grief. There are sad little footnotes in the archives. A note from a steward paying for a coffin for a kitchen boy. A small bequest from a queen to pay for a headstone for a maid. These little flashes of humanity in the ledger books. To Sarah, who served faithfully for 30 years, £5. £5. A lifetime of silence, early mornings, and cold attics, summed up in a single line of accounting. But let's not end this section on a tombstone. Let's drift back to the living, breathing, slightly tipsy ecosystem of the palace. Because despite the hardships, despite the gout and the knees and the smoke, there was a camaraderie. The servants' hall was a community. It was a place where, once the butler had gone to bed, the younger staff could relax. Someone might play a fiddle. Someone might have smuggled a bottle of the king's good wine. There would be stories. The footman mimicking the duke's walk. The dresser complaining about the queen's terrible taste in hats. In that warm, crowded, beer-smelling room in the basement, they were the kings and queens. They were the ones who knew the truth. The people upstairs were just actors on a stage. The people downstairs were the ones running the theater. In the next part, we're going to leave the main palace building entirely. We're going to put on our heavy cloaks and walk out into the grounds. We're going to visit the vast, strange world of the royal gardens, the ice houses, and the darker, muddier reality of the royal hunt. We'll meet the people who kept their hedges perfectly square, and the people who had to track deer through the rain so the king could feel manly. It's a world of mud, frost, and very sharp tools. But for now, let's leave our old pensioner dozing in his chair by the fire at Hampton Court, dreaming of the days when he could carry a silver tray without his hands shaking. All right, let's leave the stuffy, candle-smoked air of the palace interior. We've spent enough time staring at the ceiling of the servants' hall and worrying about the king's socks. Let's put on a heavy wool cloak, maybe grab a lantern, because it's always dimly lit in history, and step out the side door. We are going into the grounds. Now, when you or I think of a garden, we think of a nice patch of grass, maybe a few hydrangeas that are struggling to survive, and a lawn chair. But when a king thought of a garden, especially a French king like Louis XIV, he thought of total domination of nature. The gardens of Versailles or Hampton Court weren't just places to take a walk. They were statements of power. They were saying, I am so powerful that even the trees stand in a straight line when I look at them. But trees, notoriously, do not like standing in straight lines. They like to grow weird branches and drop leaves and do messy, organic things. So, to maintain this illusion of perfect geometry, you needed an army, a literal army of gardeners. The head gardener, like the legendary André Le Nitry at Versailles, was basically a celebrity architect. He pointed at a swamp and said, "Make that a lake," and it happened. But the guys actually in the mud? Their lives were an endless battle against entropy. Imagine being the topiarist. Your entire existence is defined by the sharpness of your shears. You have to trim a hedge that is 3 miles long. By the time you finish one end, the other end has grown back. It is the gardening equivalent of painting the Golden Gate Bridge. It never stops. And these weren't just square hedges. They were shaped like obelisks, bowls, birds, and mythological beasts. You had to climb tall wooden ladders, balancing precariously, to give a leafy haircut to a bush shaped like a griffin. If you slipped and fell into the griffin, well, try not to break any branches on the way down. The branch is worth more than you. And then there were the lawns. The concept of the perfect lawn is a nightmare even with modern mowers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, they didn't have mowers. They had scythes and sheep. But you couldn't have sheep wandering around the formal parterres eating the prize tulips. So, men had to scythe the grass. Scything is hard work. It requires a rhythmic, swinging motion that destroys your back. And to get that carpet look the king wanted, they had to do it constantly. And then they had to roll it. With heavy stone rollers pulled by, well, usually by men, because horses leave hoof prints. So, picture a team of sweaty guys dragging a giant stone cylinder across the grass, so that the king's shoes don't get wet with dew. Let's talk about the orangeries. Oranges and lemons were the ultimate status symbols in Northern Europe. They don't grow there naturally. If you wanted an orange tree in Paris or London, you had to fight the climate. This meant growing them in massive wooden tubs. In the summer, these tubs were hauled outside to line the walkways. And when I say hauled, I mean it took 4 to 6 men to lift one tree. There were thousands of them. It was a mass migration of citrus. Then, as soon as the first frost threatened, the panic began. Save the lemons. The same poor guys had to haul them all back inside the Orangeria giant greenhouse. With high windows. But glass windows aren't enough to keep out a freezing winter night. So, the servants had to keep the fires burning. They had wood-burning stoves inside the greenhouse to keep the trees cozy. The stokers spent their nights feeding logs into heaters, so the King-S marmalade supply didn't freeze, while they themselves probably slept in a drafty shed. The trees had better heating than the staff. That's just standard royal prioritization. Speaking of freezing, let us drift over to one of the most fascinating and claustrophobic jobs on the estate. The ice team. Before refrigerators, if you wanted a cold drink or a sorbet in July, you needed ice that had been harvested in January. Every major estate had an ice house. It was a deep, brick-lined pit, usually built into a hill and covered with earth for insulation. It looked like a hobbit hole, but darker and colder. The job started in the dead of winter. When the lakes and ponds froze over, the estate workers had to go out with saws. They cut massive blocks of ice from the surface. It was dangerous work. The ice was slippery, the water was freezing, and the blocks were heavy. People fell in. Frostbite was just part of the Tuesday's schedule. They would drag these blocks to the ice house and pack them in. But you couldn't just throw them in. You had to pack them with straw and sawdust for insulation. The goal was to create a solid, compressed mass of ice. Then they sealed the door. Fast forward to a sweltering day in August. The king wants a lemon ice. The servants have to go to the ice house, unseal the door, and descend into the dark, damp pit. They have to hack away a chunk of the ice which has been sitting there for 6 months, haul it up into the heat, wash off the sawdust, and run it to the kitchen before it melts. It's a race against physics. The confectioner, the chef in charge of sweets, would then use this ice to freeze the cream or fruit juice in a pewter pot. It was a magic trick. To the guests, eating frozen cream in the middle of summer was a sign that the king controlled the seasons. To the guy who nearly lost a toe to frostbite in January, it was just a lot of work for a dessert he'd never get to taste. Now, let's move from the stationary nature gardens to the moving nature, the royal hunt. Hunting was the obsession of European royalty. It was their golf, their gym, and their therapy all rolled into one. But a royal hunt wasn't just a few guys walking into the woods with bows. It was a military operation. The Grand Veneur, or Master of the Hunt, was a high noble. But the real work was done by the kennel masters, the beaters, and the trackers. Let's start with the dogs. A royal pack could have hundreds of hounds. Beagles, staghounds, greyhounds. They all needed to be fed, exercised, and cleaned. The kennel boys lived with the dogs. Literally, they slept in the straw with them to keep them warm and to stop them from fighting. You can imagine the smell. If you think the wet dog smell is bad in your living room, imagine it multiplied by 300. When the hunt actually happened, the beaters were deployed. These were often local peasants or low-ranking estate workers. Their job was to walk through the thick brush, brambles, and swamps, making noise to scare the deer or the boar towards the king. They were the human broom sweeping the forest. They got scratched, bitten by insects, and occasionally if the king was a bad shot they had to dodge a stray arrow or musket ball. And the logistics of the hunt picnic were insane. The king didn't just pack a sandwich. The entire kitchen had to come with him. Tables, chairs, linen, silver plates, wine, hot food. Wagons of stuff followed the hunt. The servants had to set up a formal dining room in the middle of a muddy clearing. Imagine carrying a heavy oak table through a forest, then setting it up, then waiting while the king eats a meat pie, then packing it all up again. And if it rained, misery, just wet velvet and soggy bread. There was also the delicate matter of the chaise Percy in the wild. We talked about the groom of the stool earlier, but what happens when nature calls? In nature, the king is not going to squat behind a bush like a commoner. Oh no. A servant had to carry a portable toilet, a velvet-covered box with a pot inside and a tent. When the king signaled, the tent went up, the box went in, and the transaction occurred with dignity. Then the servant had to carry the results back to the castle. It gives a whole new meaning to packing it out. Let's float over to a different kind of outdoor spectacle. The fountains. There wasn't enough water pressure to run all the fountains at once. So they had to cheat. As the king walked through the garden, the fontainier had to anticipate his path. He would signal to his assistants' boys hiding in the bushes near the valves. Using a series of whistles or flags, the king is approaching the dragon fountain. Turn it on. The boy would crank the heavy iron valve, and the water would shoot up just as the king came into view. Ah, beautiful, the king would say. Then, as soon as he walked past, the boy would frantically shut it off to save water, and the teen would sprint to the next fountain down the line to turn that one on. It was a high-stakes game of whack-a-mole. If the king turned around unexpectedly, disaster. He would see a dry fountain. The illusion would be broken. The fontainier lived in a state of constant anxiety, washing the royal walking pace and praying the pipes didn't burst. And the pipes did burst often. The infrastructure was miles of lead and cast iron, buried underground. When a leak sprung, the plumbers from the Latin plumbum for lead had to dig it up. They worked in muddy trenches, melting lead to patch the holes. Lead poisoning was just another perk of the job. Finally, let's visit the weirdest part of the royal grounds, the menagerie. Before zoos, kings collected animals like Pokemon, lions, tigers, elephants, ostriches. They were kept in the menagerie to show off the reach of the empire. Look, I own a beast from Africa. But who took care of them? Not the zoologists, because they didn't really exist yet. It was usually just some guy, the keeper of the lions. These animals were often kept in small, stone cages. They were cold, miserable, and confused, and the keepers had to feed them without safety barriers. There are records of keepers being mauled, bitten, or just crushed. There was a famous elephant at Versailles under Louis XIV. It was a diplomatic gift. The servants had no idea what an elephant ate. They gave it bucketfuls of wine and bread. The elephant, understandably, was often drunk and grumpy. Dealing with a drunk elephant in a stone enclosure is a workplace hazard that is hard to explain on an insurance form. And the birds. The aviaries were filled with exotic birds that required specific temperatures and diets. The bird keeper spent his life catching flies or chopping up fruit, trying to keep these fragile, colorful creatures alive in a climate that wanted to kill them. As the sun sets over the royal gardens, the work doesn't stop. The gardeners are raking the gravel paths so that they look untouched for the morning. The fontainier is checking the reservoir levels. The ice house crew is sealing the pit back up. The kennel boys are trying to sleep while 50 beagles snore round them. The palace grounds, which look so serene and empty in the paintings, were actually teeming with people, hidden in the hedgerows, crouched behind the statues, sweating in the orangeries. They were the stage hands of nature, pulling the ropes and pulleys to make sure the sun rose on a perfect world for the monarch. It's a quiet, green, and exhausting life. And as the twilight settles on the perfectly trimmed yew trees, looking like dark sentinels in the gloom, we can almost hear the sigh of the gardeners putting down their shears. In the final part of our journey, we will return to the human side of things. We look at the scandals, the illicit romances, the petty thefts, and the strange, unwritten code of honor that bound these servants together. We'll see what happened when the revolution came, and the servants had to choose between their jobs and their heads. But for now, let us leave the fontainier to his leaking pipes, and the keeper of the lions to his drunk elephant, and drift back towards the warm glow of the palace windows. Welcome back inside. Wipe the mud off your boots carefully, or the housekeeper will have your head, and let's head down the back stairs one last time. We've looked at the work, the pain, the cold food, and the frozen oranges. But a palace wasn't just a factory of etiquette, it was a home. And wherever you pack hundreds of people together in a high-stress environment with free alcohol and very little sleep, you get drama. In this final stretch, we're going to look at the human element, the secrets, the scandals, the petty crimes, and the strange, quiet end of the age of service. First, let's talk about romance, or rather, the lack of it. Officially, romance below stairs was strictly forbidden. The rule was no followers. If you were a housemaid, you couldn't have your boyfriend visit. If you were a footman, you weren't supposed to be flirting with the kitchen staff. The management preferred their servants to be celibate work monkeys. A married servant might want to live outside the palace or have children, and children are messy and distracting. But humans being humans, the palaces were absolute hotbeds of illicit relationships. It just required a lot of creativity. Courting had to happen in the few unsupervised moments between tasks. A whisper in the laundry room while folding sheets. A stolen glance across the table during the servants' dinner. A note hidden in a coal bucket. The stakes were high. If you were caught, you were fired without a reference. And in the 19th century, no reference meant you didn't work again. You were destitute. So, every romance was a high-wire act. There are stories of footmen and maids who managed to be walking out together for years, without the butler knowing. They would meet on their half-day off, usually once a month, walk around the park, sit on a bench, not touch each other because that would be improper, and then go back to the palace and pretend to be strangers. It's a very repressed, very British kind of love story. I love you. Now go polish the silver while I ignore you for 3 weeks. And then there were the scandals involving the upstairs people. We all know the clichés of the Duke and the chambermaid, but the reality was usually much messier and less romantic. Servants were often the targets of unwanted attention from the royals or their guests, and they had very little power to say no. However, sometimes the power dynamic flipped. A servant who knew about the Duke's affair or the Queen's gambling debts became dangerous. Knowledge was currency. The listening servant is a trope for a reason. They were furniture. Remember, people say things in front of furniture that they wouldn't say in front of a person. The valet knew who visited the king at midnight. The lady's maid knew which letters the queen burned in the fireplace. This created a weird economy of silence. I won't mention the late-night visitor if you don't mention that I drank a bottle of your best port. A delicate, unspoken blackmail kept the household in equilibrium. This brings us to the topic of perks versus theft. The line was blurry. Servants believed in customary rights. For example, candle ends. In a massive palace, thousands of wax candles were used. They were never burned all the way down. The leftover stumps, ends, were considered the property of the footmen or the lighting staff. They would collect them, melt them down, or sell them back to the candle maker. It was a recognized side hustle. Similarly, the cook had the right to the drippings the animal fat left over from roasting meat. They sold this to the soap makers. It was a perk of the job. But then you had the grey areas. Was taking a bottle of wine stealing? The butler might argue that he was just checking the quality to ensure the king wasn't poisoned. Was taking a piece of lace stealing? The lady's maid might say the queen was done with it. The palaces were constantly leaking goods. There was a famous incident at Versailles where the king's gold fringes were cut off his curtains. While he was at dinner, someone just walked in, snipped the gold, and walked out. The security was surprisingly lax because there were simply too many people coming and going. The palace was a sieve, but the biggest theft was actually time. The art of shirking, finding a corner of the wine cellar to nap in, pretending to be busy polishing a spoon that was already clean. The servants developed a sixth sense for when the steward was coming. The room would be silent. Then suddenly, as footsteps approached, a flurry of activity would begin. Dusting, sweeping, polishing. The steward would walk through, nod approvingly, and leave, and the room would instantly go back to sleep. Now, let's fast forward to the moments when the machine broke completely. The revolutions, the mob marches on Versailles. They break into the palace. The king and queen are forced to leave for Paris. They get into their carriages and they go. But they leave behind thousands of staff. Imagine standing in the Hall of Mirrors after the royal family has fled. The floor is covered in mud from the protesters' boots. The windows are broken. The king is gone. What do you do? Do you keep cleaning? Do you leave? Many servants just stayed. They didn't know what else to do. This was their home. There are accounts of servants trying to protect the furniture from looters, saying things like, "Please don't scratch the commode. It belongs to the crown." The crown was falling. The world was on fire, but the training ran deep. You protect the furniture. Eventually, the palace was shuttered. The servants were dismissed. And this is the tragedy that often gets overlooked. These people were specialists. A man who has spent 20 years perfecting the art of opening a door for a king is not really qualified for any other job. He can't farm. He can't build houses. He is a relic. Many of them ended up in poverty, drifting through a Paris that hated everything they represented. They were the valets of tyrants. They were viewed with suspicion. They had to hide their liveries, burn their uniforms, and try to blend in with the very people they used to look down on. We see a similar, sadder story in the Russian Revolution. When the Romanovs were arrested, some of their servants went with them, voluntarily. Dr. Botkin, the physician, Trupp, the footman, Demidova, the maid, Karatanov, the cook. They were given the chance to leave. The Bolsheviks said, "You are workers. You are free to go. We only want the Tsar." But they stayed. They followed the family into exile, to that bleak house in Siberia. They cooked for them, cleaned for them, and tried to keep up the pretense of a royal court in a house with barred windows. Why? It wasn't for the money. There was no money left. It wasn't for power. It was a profound, ingrained loyalty. Or perhaps they just couldn't imagine a world where they didn't serve. They died with the family in that basement in Ekaterinburg. The footman stood by the Tsar until the very end. It's a dark, heavy thought, but it shows the intense, almost cult-like bond that could form in the isolation of the palace. But let's pull back from the tragic edge. Most servants didn't die in revolutions. Most just watched the world change slowly. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the Great War happened. The young footmen went to the trenches and realized that there was more to life than powdering their hair. The maids went to work in munitions factories and realized they could make good money without a housekeeper screaming at them about dust. The servant problem became the obsession of the upper classes in the 1920s. You just can't get good help anymore. Well, no, because people stopped wanting to live in a basement and work 16-hour days for peanuts. The modern world offered freedom. The silence of the palace was replaced by the noise of the factory, the cinema, and the department store. The great houses began to shrink. The armies of gardeners were replaced by a few guys with lawnmowers. The hundreds of indoor staff were replaced by a vacuum cleaner and a daily cleaner. The rituals died out. No one asses the meat anymore. No one needs a groom of the stool. And so, the palaces became what they are today, museums. When you visit a place like Hampton Court or Versailles now, you walk through the king's bedroom. You look at the bed. You look at the painted ceiling. But I want you to look at the door in the corner, the small one, cut into the wallpaper. That's where the real story is. Behind that door is a narrow, dark staircase. If you could walk through it, you'd feel the temperature drop. You'd smell the phantom scent of beeswax, stale beer, and lye soap. You'd hear the ghost of a bell ringing, a sharp, demanding tinkle that makes your stomach tighten. You'd see the scullery maid rubbing her raw hands, the footman checking his calves in the mirror, the page boy fighting sleep outside the door, the old pensioner dreaming by the fire. They are the ones who polished the history we look at today. They kept the gold shiny so we could admire it centuries later. They lived their entire lives in the background, quiet, efficient, and largely forgotten. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, don't think about the kings and queens. They have enough attention. Think about the quiet ones. Think of the silence of a palace at 3 a.m. The only sound is the settling of the old wood and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. The fire is low. The work is done. The uniform is hung up. The servant sleeps, and for a few hours, in their dreams. They don't have to bow to anyone. Good night, guys. Sleep well.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire there would be no food like today. no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people did young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warm and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal were afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to cool lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities were born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factors started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you. Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools, and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing, but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People shivered at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warmth and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal we are afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans to spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities we are born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factors started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling mm, very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you.